All right, so quickly about me. This is my 10th year helping people to lift up heavy things. This is my 5th year as a massage therapist. I am a power lifter who also mountain bikes. I'm ex-corrective exercise specialist. If you want to know what that means, you can ask me later. I work largely with endurance athletes and post-rehab athletes. So a lot of people that are in pain or a lot of people that are trying to train through pain. And I am the petter of dogs and devourer of sushi. For any of you that work with me, you know that my dog comes with me to work every day. She's a big part of the program. So I got my first endurance athlete probably 2 years into my career. And that raised a lot of questions for me because they came to me from a physical therapist and they were told, you just need to strength train to get stronger. How many of you have been told that you need to strength train to get strong, or you need to strength train for your performance, for your injury, for something with your sport? Raise your hand. All right, so usually you hear kind of generic things like you need to just get stronger, you need to work your core, you need to do this to decrease your injury. The problem is, how many of you have been told how to do that specifically? So I see like 1, maybe 2 hands. So the thing is there's not a lot of accurate stuff written, and what I mean by that is if you go into strength and conditioning texts, like super training, block periodization, stuff that's like this thick, full of research and full of information, you generally see 1 page dedicated to the endurance athlete. If you look at the research being done, it is usually not the best. To be honest, exercise science research is kind of the black sheep of the research field. Sample studies are usually small. The methods used for measurement are usually very questionable. And so there's just not a lot of true research going on. When I got that first endurance athlete, I went to super training, I went to block periodization, I went to the NASM charts, I went to the corrective exercise specialist charts. I was trying to figure out what it is I need to do with this person. They had signed up for a 24-pack, meaning for the next 12 weeks, I was going to see them twice, and I needed to have information on what to do. Of course, Runner's World gave me the 5 exercises that every runner needs to do, but that doesn't do much for you when you're trying to figure out an overall plan. So, what I have been looking into over the last roughly 8 years is how do I actually structure this to make it a true strength and conditioning program. Anybody that has been around endurance athletes knows how dedicated they are, how much of a lifestyle factor it is, how much grit they're gonna have to keep training. And yet, as a strength conditioning coach, I wanna make sure that that is fulfilled. I don't wanna just give them some frou-frou program and just burn the hour. So what we're going to talk about today is a lot of the stuff that I have delved into over the last 8 years. We are going to go into the role of a strength training and a strength coach for endurance athletes. I'm going to tell you what my job is. I'm going to tell you how I look into injury, how I look into performance. Then we're going to talk quickly about, well, not quickly, but we're going to talk pretty at length actually about designing the programs. And then I'm going to try to give you guys a lot of stuff to take away from this. So ideally, tomorrow morning, if you go to the gym, you should know exactly what you should do. Before we get started, does anybody have any quick questions? No? All right, cool. All right, so the role of a strength coach for triathletes. The role of a strength coach for any athlete is first, identify how to make them better, and then identify how to keep them healthy. So when it comes to performance for an endurance athlete, honestly, it's mainly for me, how do I increase their economy? How do I increase their endurance? Everything else should be done by the actual triathlete coach. When it comes to injury, stuff for injury, obviously I'm looking at predictors for running, predictors for cycling, predictors for swimming. The problem is that this is not as simple as it is for other sports. In soccer, we're looking at ACL prevention. We know like the dynamics of cutting and force production. In football, we're looking at how they're going to react to concussions. For triathlon and any endurance sport, it is super complicated because we don't have true mechanisms of injury yet. We're looking at repetitive strain injuries, we're looking at connective tissue profiles, we're looking at all these other sampling and trying to figure out how do we keep these people healthy. So to put it pretty simply, what I should do is I should ensure and improve your ability to get in all the positions and to execute the movements of your sport, and I should ensure and improve your resilience of your body to take stress from the sport. What I should not do, and this is probably the more important factor, is I should not worry about your swim, bike, and run. I shouldn't do a run analysis on you. I shouldn't look at your bike. That is not my job. I'm not a tri coach. I'm just going to make you stronger and more resilient. The biggest thing, though, is also that I want to point out here that is a really big issue in strength conditioning for endurance athletes is I do not want to cause any unnecessary fatigue or maladaptation. So the first rule is do no harm. And that is where a lot of misconceptions and actually true conceptions come in with strength training for triathletes or endurance athletes in general. And then also the big thing is, especially since I am a massage therapist, I am not a direct treater of injury. I do provide treatment, I do help with pain. It is part of the program, but a physical therapist should do that. And so that's, again, why for a strength conditioning coach with the corrective exercise stuff, I could talk at length. But I am not going to be the primary person treating your tendinopathy. All right, so going into injury prevention, lots of misconceptions here that I just do want to address. So it's probably not because you're tight. It's probably not because you didn't stretch. There are a whole lot of factors, and one of the things that we really need to get into is this fact is repetitive strain injuries, because that's the name of the game for endurance athletes. A quick note before we get into too much detail is I'm not going to go into a lot of mechanical factors, especially with running. And the reason for this is that if you look at some of the newest research, we used to have back in like the early 2000s, lots of biomechanical research where they would say like, oh, look at hip internal rotation of people with knee pain. Oh, look at how the foot strikes on people with plantar. And when we actually go back and do a meta-analysis of it, they were not reliable. The methods that they were using to measure weren't that great. And what they found is that we're just really bad at predicting the mechanics of running injury. That's not to say efficiency. So again, if you're doing a run analysis, that's great. If someone is actually looking at it from a point of how can we make you better and get you less, make it so it's less energy, boost your economy, completely different. But for the factor of injury, which again is my job to tell you how we can actually prevent injury, we can't really put too much emphasis on the actual running mechanics. The other thing that I do want to point out is that there's a Goldilocks factor, meaning obviously if it's way too hot, it's a problem, and if it's way too cold, it's a problem. So anytime you see that in mechanics, there's probably going to be a good middle ground. It's just right now where the research is and what the information we're getting, it's kind of hard for us as professionals to find that middle ground. Now I will say for swimming, that is completely different, and I'll go over the swimming mechanics and stuff that I do with people later. And cycling, again, that's the bike fit guy. That's not me. All right, the other thing that I need to address really quickly is that pain is very subjective, and pain doesn't necessarily mean injury. Because endurance athletes do such a high volume and take such a high volume of stress, pain is inevitable. Like, you guys are really good at getting used to the lactate, getting used to discomfort. The thing is that there's going to be some predictors that aren't really necessarily injuries that will predict more likelihood of pain. And so this is kind of going to lead us into a bigger conversation in a second, but what we need to know is that pain is going to be the resultant of more holistic factors. It's not, again, it's not just that you're tight. All right, really quickly on repetitive strain injuries. Pretty obvious, it's just an overuse injury. It's tendinopathy, it is patellofemoral syndrome, plantar fasciitis. And again, it has a lot to do with pain, but because pain is so subjective, it doesn't necessarily mean pain. And pain is also a bad predictor of the presence of a repetitive strain injury. And so that is why we use the boiling a frog analogy, because this is a really gross analogy, I don't know what neuroscientist used it, but if you were to boil a frog, the frog doesn't know that it's in trouble until it's already almost dead. So again, pain is not a good predictor for dealing with repetitive strain injuries, and a lot of times for some of these issues, once the symptoms and the pain have gone, it doesn't mean that the underlying pathology in the tissue is gone. And again, we're going to get into that a little bit deeper in a second, but these are just some things that we need to have as an overview. Does anybody have any questions thus far? Oh, okay, 1 second. I have one arm right now, so I'm just going to take a couple seconds of it. All right. So the number one factor that I look at when I work with athletes is kind of the holistic stress profile. I like to use the stress bucket model because I think it is a very simplistic and accurate way of looking at this. It explains why, for us as coaches, certain athletes are going to have a higher work capacity, and it explains just a lot about given training situations. So again, when we're looking at the incidence of pain and injury, it has to be holistic. If we look at this, like the bucket as you, here's your stress. Here's your recovery. If the bucket gets overfilled, you're gonna have problems. And so obviously right here it has listed injury, depression, getting sick, whatever. But a bigger factor that we see a lot of the time is just a decrease in performance. And so a lot of times if we were to actually track decreases in performance, we could actually probably track the predictor of injury. The hard part is that for a lot of endurance athletes, we don't really know the big decrease in performance until we're getting closer to the actual where we're measuring. So some athletes will go through large blocks without kind of knowing where they're sitting. Now, the more room that is in that bucket, the higher the work capacity of the athlete. I wish I could tell you we had great ways of measuring this, but we don't. It has to be very subjective. HRV claims to, but I have a lot of issues with it. So a lot of times this is just when your relationship with your coach, you're talking with the coach, and the coach kind of knowing what you're dealing with can make a huge change into how they're going to train you. And that is simply because training is just a response to another stress up here. So again, the more room in that bucket, the more training you can fit in. And as long as that bucket's not overfilling, you will get super compensation from training. So here's your fitness baseline, and as you recover, you have super compensation, and you can take more stress. Now, what's interesting, if we go back right here, that I do want to point out really quick, is that some of these don't have to be in large quantity, but they can be in large in perception, and it'll fill that bucket more. So someone who has an asshole boss, but deals with it fine, it's not gonna fill that bucket up that much. But someone who has an asshole boss that keeps thinking about it, and it just leaches into every part of their life, it's gonna fill the crap out of that bucket, it's gonna prevent them from sleeping, it's gonna affect their diet, and then they don't have that big of a work capacity. The same thing can be said for training. So again, the more fit someone is, the smaller that same training stimulus will be. So that's why over time we have to add more and more and more to our training. The reason that I wanted to bring this up is because you have to kind of understand these two slides to really get the part that matters. And this is a chart taken from Dye of 2005. What he did is he's the big patellofemoral syndrome researcher. And essentially, he created this graph to help predict injury. And again, this is going to be very relative to the individual. That's why there's no numbers on it. But essentially, for joints, there's this zone of supraphysiological load, and a zone of homeostasis, and a zone of failure. Now, if you jump off of, let's say, an 8-foot box for some reason, the loading's right there, but you'll probably be fine. 2 stories is probably up here. If you're running a marathon and you're trained, you're probably over here. If you're running a marathon and you're undertrained, you're right here. And so the key to understanding this is that this is going to move, and where you're at with frequency depends on how much training stress you have on you at that moment. So if you are filling that bucket over too much all the time, and you're not getting that super compensation, and let's say you still have fatigue left over, then even though you come in to see me and I don't take any of that into consideration, and I give you plyometrics, and you're holding this fatigue over here, and that plyometric would land you in an intensity about that, you hit there, and all of a sudden you have calf injury. So that is why a strength and conditioning coach, for an endurance athlete especially, needs to have all these into consideration. It is why if you look at my training for athletes in season, pre-season, off-season, I am considering how much stress is already in that system. Are they in a build? Are they in a taper? What is going on? Where are they at here? So, like I said, for most of my athletes, I mainly just got to consider the knees and the ankles with this. Swimmers, obviously, I'm going to consider more shoulders. But with this, you can kind of see how with injury prevention, it's not up to the stress, or it's not up to the stretching. It's not, you can keep adding and adding and adding more stuff to try to make yourself stronger, to try to make yourself resistant. But at the end of the day, it's stress management that is going to be the #1 predictor. Now, again, if I, in the off season, if I can make it so that we have super compensation and the connective tissue and stuff around that knee is higher, then you'll be able to take this more because that stress going in that bucket doesn't seem as high. All right, so now that you kind of got the overview, we're gonna look in a few specific factors dealing with running and cycling and swimming. Does anybody have questions on these 3 slides? Because like I said, these, in my opinion, if you can understand them as an athlete, really go a long way to help your own specific training. No? Okay, all right. All right, so some of that research that we have found, the first factor that I would like to point out is a BMI greater than 30 was shown to have increased incidence of running over periods of hours. A lot of the studies look strictly at BMI versus body compensation. In my opinion, body compensation. Yeah, body compensation. So BMI, obviously, is just the matter of stress of the impact. So again, if someone is just a little bit heavier, every run that they do is going to put them a little bit more high on that intensity scale. I can speak as myself as somewhat of a novice runner, and especially as more of a lifter, that I can't handle the volume that a traditional novice runner can handle. So when I work with an athlete, if their BMI is greater than 30, that is something that we try to address. Obviously, if it's a guy that looks like a bodybuilder and is huge, it's a little bit different. And we'll get into, like I said, the actual fat mass, body mass, stuff of that later. Previous injuries are also like a really big predictor, and that's pretty obvious. Once there is an injury to the body, and if it's not managed well, then if we go back to that graph from Dye, it's just going to make it so that the body cannot take as much, and that envelope of function has shrunk. So that is why working with a good physical therapist and then also getting strength training afterwards is super important. A sudden increase in volume and intensity. It's pretty obvious. Running experience was a big predictor, and again, that's something I don't work on, but just because I don't help with some of these doesn't mean it doesn't go into my calculations when I'm prescribing loads and stuff in the weight room. Age between 45 and 65. This is one that, again, I saw it. As people age, their tendons get stiffer, which can actually be a good thing, but as you'll see later in the slides, it's a consideration, and it's a consideration that a lot of people don't take into affecting their training. And then a big takeaway is that speed work is more likely to be the point of injury than long, slow distance work. It's for this reason that when I have an endurance athlete, some coaches like to just give the training load, and they say, just get this done in a week. And I usually tell people when they're freshest, try to do their speed work, and I usually try to make it so that I consolidate the strength with the speed work. And the reason is like I said, if someone is fresh and they don't have the fatigue, think of where they're sitting at that graph with the one with Dye. All right. Predictors of injury in cycling. So age, weight, and increased time on the bike have been associated with low back pain. One of the things is that when you look at the research on cycling is that even though they had that, knee pain was the most common, but the data is super inconsistent. They don't really know why. Running in a wall car or falling onto a thing of concrete is the biggest predictor of injuries on a bike. That being said though, for me as a strength coach, if someone's spending a lot of time on the bike, I need to consider their lower back. I need to consider a couple things with their knee. And it's also, these things give me an idea of where I need to work in the off season. Just because I'm not going to go into this too much in depth later on, what I will say is that spinal loading on the off season, getting someone to be able to hold a crap ton of weight in front of them, I have found to be very relieving on the low back in season because their trunk is so much stronger to support things. And swimming. Swimming has little to no research in the injury profile realm. And to be honest, the research that I did find was not good. So I'm only going to speak anecdotally here. What I have found in the triathlete population is completely different in the actual competitive swimmer population. Triathletes are generally going to be just more limited in their shoulder flexion and thoracic mobility. So everybody, I want you to go ahead and take your arms, and I want you to raise them straight over your head. Okay, if a lot of you went here, then that is something that we would want to work on in the weight room. If you guys were able to get that full range, fine, then that's great. The reason is again, I want to make sure that you have the ability to get in the positions for your sport. If you can't get there to help your crawl, then I know that your shoulder mechanics are going to be off. And I know that a lot of times you're not going to be able to hold a good streamlined position. Thoracic mobility as well, and poor breathing, spinal stabilization strategies. So the other thing, I want you guys to all put one hand on your chest and one hand on your belly. Take a deep breath in and out. Which hand did the most movement? Which hand did the most movement? So which hand was moving the most? The chest? Which is fine when you are on a bike and a run. But a lot of the times for swimming, if you guys have ever worked with Dominic Latella of Swimbox, me and him did the foundational breathing method years ago. We have found that teaching a swimmer diaphragmatic breathing and be able to maintain it helps you to create better core stability during the swim, increases buoyancy, and it's going to keep you from overarching while you're going and looking like a banana. That is something that, in my opinion, needs to be trained in the weight room under load, because when you train something under load, you are training it to stick. Now, when you're running and stuff, by all means, breathe through here. You're not going to be able to do a whole lot breathing through your belly during endurance stuff. Limited thoracic mobility. This is something that I would say I see as an issue, but it tends to help people that have really tight thoracic spines. A lot of people, if they can rotate at least 30 degrees, they're fine, but I've had some people where I tell them to rotate and they're doing this, so that's something I'm going to work on. All right, and the other thing is, you don't see this as much in the endurance or in the triathlete community, but an overabundance of hard interval sets tends to make the neck and shoulders cranky, especially because what I find is that swim coaches, generally when we are doing the club teams, they're not prescribing to the individual, they're prescribing to the group. So a lot of times when a triathlete goes to some of these swim clubs, they may do it and they're doing the same volume as someone who's only doing swimming. So a lot of times if they're doing just hard interval sets with that training, you tend to see some things get cranky. All right, are there any questions on the injury stuff I just went over? Anybody? Any? So, I think I did see one, but I didn't like it. The data for me wasn't something that I could really include well, and that it's just sort of like, what do I do with that? So a lot of times for me, when I'm peering through this data, for me, I'm a very big believer of whatever I measure, I need to be able to do something about. And because a lot of times I'm just giving you factors that are going to stress you out, right? And that is why I'm a really big believer of I'm going to look at the factors that actually we know for sure predict injury. Again, my role as a strength coach is to figure out how to give you ability, not just ability to do stuff, but availability to train. And so if I am telling you the whole time, man, your hamstrings are really tight, you're going to get hurt, you're going to get hurt, you're going to get hurt. Now there's a nocibic thought in your head that's going to lead to my body's kind of weak, my body's not resilient, I'm going to have issues with training. And so again, if we go back to that stress bucket model, then that perception is going to make your training harder, you're going to be thinking about it, it's going to stress you out, and now there's another stressor to add. That's why for me, I get really pissed off when I have other professionals tell people like, oh no, you're going to get hurt. And as you just saw in the data, we can't say that about a lot of things. So that's why for a lot of the time, it needs to be individualistic. We shouldn't talk in only a SIF talks in absolutes. So we need to look at the actual, what we can work on, what we can measure. So for something like that, I do believe that that is a thing. I mean, estrogen and all that plays in collagen synthesis and tons of other stuff. I would say personally that not necessarily due to the female cycle specifically, but due to larger systemic pathologies, whether it be something with the endocrine system or some other just disease, you're gonna see more risk factors, right? So like if you look at, like I took a couple slides out of this because I did not want it to be too long and me just throwing study after study after study at you guys. But if you look at some of the bone density studies when they were looking at stress fracture predictions, a lot of the time, like some of the predictions were, did you drink milk as a kid? Have you had a history of eating disorder? Have you had some of these other things that are more pathological? In my opinion, it's kind of rare that you see a stress fracture happen to somebody because their training load was really off. There's usually also some other contributing factors, right? So that's why when I did see some stuff talking about women's hormone profile, but it was more on ACL tears, if I remember right, than it was like, again, these repetitive strain injuries. So, anybody else have a question? I think, Christy, did you?
I was just going to ask if you mentioned time
Time for each person?
Well, in regards to injury, not taking
Yeah, and that's going to be, again, something that I think is really hard to measure. So, if you look at most strength programs, and not talking about great strength programs, for lifters, one of the things that is kind of cool in strength work, like say like a power lifter, we can test our performance really frequently. For an endurance athlete, you can't test that frequently because that would blow you up. You can test like time at like your power output on the bike and stuff, but again, super fatiguing. It's hard to build into a good training model. For me as a power lifter, like right now I'm running a program where I squat to almost a 1 rep max every day because I can't do anything else. And I can take that and I can see and then track my numbers and see if I'm actually recovering correctly and no. It is, in my opinion, really hard for a lot of endurance athletes, and that's why you gotta be really subjective about it. Like, am I sleeping? Is my mood off? Things like that. So when you look at the research on recovery, and most of my athletes that train with me, you know that like in my training app, when you open it up, it asks you what's your mood, what's your stress, what's your this, what's your that. And I could pull that data up over a period of time and look at what's going on. That is actually one of the best predictors when you look at the studies. When you look at HRV, a lot of the studies are going to be done by the people selling the HRV devices. And the other thing is with HRV, in order to, an HRV is going to get your, like I said, HRV should be predicting like where your nervous system sits, how much stress you have on you, but it is looking at the range of data, right? So it is taking a snapshot and assuming this is normal for you. If you have a crap ton of stress, a really busy lifestyle and everything else, and like you're in a lot of stress when the HRV is taking that data, it assumes that's your norm. So it might just be like, oh, you're recovered, but you've never been recovered, right? And that's what I see a lot. Like I played with HRV for a long time. I used a bunch of different systems. And I can tell you, I just wasn't a huge fan of it. I know some people that implement it very successfully, but the people that I know that implemented it most had a full month of just like easy living, easy training, and they were able to know what their prime optimum physiological function was to measure against. So, do you have a question? Oh, heart rate variability. So you're seeing it a lot with like Whoop straps, with Garmin does it a lot. There's different systems. And HRV is ideally looking at the variability with your heart rhythms. And it spits out, depending on which model you're using, numbers to tell you how recovered you are. And so you get the measurement every day, and it'll tell you based off the day. The hard part is, what if I wanted you fatigued in a training block, like I'm your coach, and I'm like, she shouldn't be recovering right now because we're quantifying the stress? Or was your boss a big asshole the other day because that's gonna all of a sudden tank it? I know people that have done it and they drink a beer and it tanks. So I will say that predicting for training, not a huge fan for HRV, for helping someone get their lifestyle to improve, I actually am a big proponent of it. I just don't think that you need to go that deep most of the time. Some people, they really like that feedback. It's great. I've had several people that they're like, yeah, I cut out my nightly beer because I saw what it was doing to my training. But as far as using it to track performance, I just think that it's not there yet for me to recommend, and that's just my personal opinion. So, any other questions? Yeah.
How do you think that compares to what training peaks all over this?
I don't know particularly what their algorithms and what they take off of it. And again, I think it's going to also be based off what your coach is implementing. Again, for me with my system, I need a snapshot of how you're feeling that day. So a lot of times, and if you look at the research that, again, if we're talking about let's make it applicable, let's take it and use it, they have shown that just an easy PAR-Q, so like active readiness questionnaire, has been actually really easy to implement, and it predicts a lot. And so you can easily just be like, okay, for me, you're a 5 out of 5 today. We're going to train hard. We're going to hit it hard. You're a 1 out of 5. All right, none of the weights should feel heavy. So with Training Peaks, though, it's going to be really dependent on what your particular coach is implementing. So again, but yeah, I don't know what data they're pulling from. But if Training Peaks is looking at your actual performance, your zones of heart rate and stuff, I would say that that's probably going to be a pretty accurate, because like I said, if they have really accurate algorithms on your output and your heart rate and how you're working at that, it's probably a pretty good predictor. Yeah, and yeah. The hard part though is a lot of and so a lot of things move just based off the day, and you'll see what and for me, again, keep in mind, that is not my zone of expertise, that's the tri coach. So for me, my zone is in here. How am I handling you? How am I making you better? I work with tons of tri coaches, and I'll talk to them about it, and I'll just kind of get a read of like, okay, how much stress are you applying and things like that. And so they're going to be more likely to look at that. For me, I don't have access to most people's Training Peaks. So I'm just going to, again, I want that quick snapshot. I want to know over time. And so, like I said, if you're pulling from that algorithm and you're using it accurately, I would think that it actually is pretty good. But there's a lot of moving variables. And for me, that's why I just don't like HRV. And because it's a lot of moving variables that isn't taking into consideration like where you should be, right? So, any other questions? That was a good one. That was kind of hard. All right, let's talk about performance factors, things that make you better, especially in the weight room. Do my thing, Doug. Ideally, let's talk about performance factors. All right, so. 1 second, my computer seems to have froze. There we go. All right. So for me, the major thing that I am working with is economy. There are some things that you can do in the weight room that will directly impact endurance. That is a much smaller bit of it. Don't worry too much about this. This is a super complicated graph, but it kind of does show realms that strength training can help. So essentially, if I can help your economy, then a lot of things get better for a triathlete. And so it's for this reason that I'm working on this, that for me, whether I'm working with a 5K runner or a marathon, it's actually super similar for me. It is just the actual volume and stress that I am laying on. As far as the methods that I'm using, as far as the movements I'm using, and as far as the overall prescription where I'm trying to get you, it's all going to be very similar. Here are the individual factors affected by strength. And I tried to put them in what I believe to be the most important at the top. So fiber optimization, you actually can't help this with strength. So type 2X fibers are the really explosive muscle fibers. They're things that you guys never use, right? If you're going on a really long run, you're gonna have to sustain. If you did type 2X, you're probably using it in a 50-meter sprint. The thing is we can help conversion to type 2A, which are a lot more fatigue resistant. And they're gonna be anaerobic and aerobic. We'll get into more of this later on, but that is something that I am actually trying to help. And again, we're going to actually go through this pretty quickly because this is cool to know, but it doesn't do you guys crap for application. So motor efficiency, just trying to decrease in muscle slack. All that means is I'm trying to get your muscles to help to be stiffer so you bounce better on that run, or you use less energy on the bike for larger power output. Connective tissue adaptation is actually huge. The more stiffness that I can create in plyometric work, the better your ankles and knees are also going to be able to bounce. Muscular force, pretty obvious, just helping you to actually put more force into the bike to also absorb more force when you're running. Mechanics to increase stability of specific joints. This is actually when post-rehab, it is the best, right? Because what we do know is after injury, there's going to be some issues with firing certain muscles, getting the patterns back, trying to actually increase load and increase that zone of function on that one graph I showed earlier. So for me, if I have someone that's coming back from patellofemoral syndrome, I'm just going to do my best to help increase stability of that knee. And then body composition, for obvious reasons, but talking about the VO2 max, or I'm sorry, the BMI earlier. Improving body composition has been shown to have a positive effect on VO2, and I will say that a lot of people in the endurance realm are scared of putting on too much muscle. If you go hardcore and you're eating a crap ton, it is possible to put on too much muscle. I know when I was working with the Marymount team as a massage therapist and doing like consulting with some of their strength work, they actually went through a realm of like lots of kind of hardcore intense lifts, and then they were putting people on kind of a high caloric diet. And they did have a couple guys that actually did put on too much muscle till they found had a negative impact. For me, that should never happen when I work with somebody. I will say putting on muscle and cross-sectional area for cyclists in the thighs has been shown to actually improve performance. Running, not so much. Again, I want to make you nice and bristly. I want to make you super strong for the weight and composition that you are. All right, so this is just a really quick tidbit because again, there is a lot more research on running than there are some of the other parts of tri. So some of the main factors that I am working on when I'm working with runners in particular is going to be the neural control. So efficiency of contraction, relaxation. That's again what I was saying with like being able to hit the ground, stay bouncy, using less energy, but still have high force. And that is also going to be playing with the stiffness and the muscle slack. Really quickly, because I'm just going to talk about muscle slack. This has tons of books written on it. Essentially, the more slack that you have in your system, the more energy you're going to have to use. So if you think about it, if I hit the ground and there's slack here, and I'll get over here so you guys can see me. If I hit the ground and I have to absorb and go deeper, that's more energy being used. But if I hit the ground and I can kind of plant and it's more of an isometric contraction, that's less energy being used. And so by working on specific qualities of that, I can actually help to increase running economy directly. Some other things that we need to be, some other things that have been shown, but the data isn't as good on this. Like there's fewer studies, they're all different. But people are looking at this idea of a hamstring quadricep ratio. All you need to know is making the hamstrings stronger in the eccentric function, so like lengthening, they think actually correlates with a better running economy. So what that means is I do a lot of strength training with my individuals where they are just training, they're lowering themselves with their hamstrings, or they are doing anything where the hamstrings are just lowering load over time slowly. And then what we'll do is when we want that to actually be expressed, so like let's say they're in season, I'm trying to make it so that these training adaptations have a higher likelihood of being expressed in the run. I'll do things that are a little bit more close to the actual application. So here are hamstring tantrums. The contraction into the ball isn't the training that I'm trying to get, it's her controlling it as it bounces back and overcoming that. So we're training the fast, ballistic, eccentric control of the hamstring. All right, now after all of that, right, how do you do that? And this is the part that has been elusive to a lot of individuals. This is the part that I think when you look at the 5 exercises that an endurance athlete, runner, whatever has to do, doesn't even touch it, right? So who thinks that lightweight training is the way to go? Who thinks that heavyweight training is the way to go? So a lot of people are kind of indecisive. All right. So this is actually kind of cool. We have a lot of research on this. So HST stands for heavy strength training. So like 5 rep max, 4 rep max, high load. Generally, so some of these studies looked at like a 4x4, 4 sets of 4 of squats at a pretty high load. And if you look, these changes were actually pretty significant, right? So what we know, this is actually probably most likely due to that conversion factor that I was talking about earlier of type 2X to type 2A fibers, because those are not going to be hit when you're doing the high rep exercises. Those are not going to be hit when you're running. And so they're going to be more fatigue resistant when you are doing the more, not explosive, but the more intensity of the run, of the bike, of the whatever. For me as a strength coach, the reason why this is actually really cool is if you remember what I said about running and when you are more likely to get hurt, it is going to be during those hard intervals, that high intensity work. Just by doing this, I've increased your capacity to fatigue there, meaning you're less likely to hit that hard interval and lose form. So now I've made you more resilient in that hard interval set. Looking at this from a big picture perspective, if I know that your coach wants you to do a lot more hard intervals to try to really build up that tempo, I am going to make sure that we have done a block worth of heavy strength training to try to get it so that you can withstand that capacity better. And the cool thing about this, though, is a lot of times when we talk about heavy strength training, explosive work, plyometric work, and sports performance, everybody assumes that it doesn't really do crap for you once you've been working out for like 30 minutes. But these studies, some of them have shown, especially this top one, that even after an hour and a half of a submaximal run, there was still an increase. And even after a 3-hour ride, there was still an increase over the control. So the bigger question here, though, is actually who's ready to pick up heavy things? And this has also been one of the harder parts of applying some of this research, right? Because you need a very skilled strength conditioning coach, trainer, whoever, weight room guy, to get you there. So before we go into this, so who lifts right now, like as part of their regimen? So a few of you, good. The hard part is that due to some of the adaptations of an endurance athlete, that you're not going to be doing this, right? You're not going to be snatching. You're not going to put your joints in certain specific movements that traditional weight training might require. So there's some considerations that need to be acknowledged, right? In general, for any strength and conditioning coach, we're going to look at progressing your movements. We're going to look at the learning curve of weight training. We're going to look at fatigue, time of season, stuff specific to you. And all of that should go into formulating a plan. And so that part, for strength coach is easy. The harder part is that endurance athletes are a whole nother beast. You guys have spent hours, weeks, years trying to accumulate the adaptations that you have right now, and they are super specific. And so you are completely different to the lacrosse player, you're completely different to the average Joe, you're completely different to almost any athlete out there. And traditionally, you're going to have a lower experience in the weight room. And that is not a bad thing. It just means that if you look at what you guys need to do to cross that line on the marathon, I'll admit the strength training isn't the main thing that you need to worry about. You need to put hours and hours and hours in running. And so that doesn't leave a lot of room for weight training for some of you. So you're going to be pretty low experience when it comes to things like squats and load. You're going to have higher pain thresholds and a higher work capacity than other athletes. Meaning, again, you're good at pushing through pain, which we probably don't want in the weight room, and you're probably going to have a much higher capacity of work, which can also be a bad thing in the weight room. If I were to leave a bunch of endurance athletes to their own devices in here, you would see hundreds of reps being done. You would see really low reps periods just because they're like, oh, no, I'm good, let's go. Just after 30 seconds of rest. You're gonna see a higher rate of perceived exertion, meaning when you hit a heavy weight, you're gonna be like, holy crap, I cannot go any heavier, but you could probably go a lot heavier. And the reason of that is just because if you think about how you train yourself, it's to put a certain amount of force and energy into each thing, even though you have a lot left. You've just become super economical at just improving force, or creating force. You're gonna have an excessively high performance with suboptimal loading. And what I mean by that is, let's say, so for me, like I said, a lot of my training, even though I don't compete, is in powerlifting. For me, if I hit my 90% of a squat max, I could probably do it for maybe 4 or 5 reps, right? For an endurance athlete, if they hit 90% of a squat max, they could probably do it for like 10. And it's just because you guys are so much more efficient at getting that work at suboptimal loading. And you'll see why that's actually a really important consideration next. You're gonna have unique mobility and strength profiles. And many times, the goal shouldn't be to increase those or improve those. And that is gonna be very specific because, again, if you think about the adaptations in cycling and running, where you're actually limiting a lot of the range of motion to be more economical of force, creating that stiffness is gonna, again, allow force. The only time that I might try to affect range of motion, again, is if I think that it is hindering mechanics, or if I think that it is contributing to some sort of pathology. I'll be perfectly honest, a lot of times I don't think that's the case. I think that a lot of times with us, when we get kind of things that feel cranky, it feels really good and it feels therapeutic to go into stretching, to have that addressed. But I do not think that actually increasing the range of motion and stuff like that for a lot of the time is a super necessary thing. And to speak kind of anecdotally, I can think of a couple strength coaches that spent a lot of time increasing the hamstring length of some of their marathon runners, and they increased their running time. So they actually got less efficient. Same thing with ankles. So that's something that, again, I don't mind you doing it when it feels bad, doing some stretching and stuff like that, that's totally fine. But for me to objectively, when you're in the weight room, try to put a crap ton of time loosening you up, I'm doing you a disservice. But there is still a higher need to address tissue resilience, and that to me is where the effort that a lot of people would traditionally put on increasing range of motion need to center their efforts. Because there is some new, pretty exciting research in that field of study. All right, so applying these considerations for programming scenarios. I know a lot of you guys aren't strength coaches or aren't trainers, but just so that you know, traditional weight training programs, probably you're not gonna have the same type of effect. You need to opt away from percentage-based programming just because, like I said, if I'm thinking like, okay, I'm gonna have her hit 90% of her 1 rep max for X amount, you're probably either underworking, or if I have you do certain AMRAPs, like as many reps as possible at this, you're gonna add a crap ton of fatigue and a crap ton of work. And so considerations really need to be made. The other thing is that you guys probably can't max out anytime soon. When an endurance athlete comes off of their training blocks, so like let's say season just finished, for traditional athletes, we would probably have them test out their squat, test out certain lifts so that we know where they're at and we can objectively follow their strength. Because endurance athletes don't spend as much time in the weight room and aren't as trained as traditional athletes, trying to test you is probably not gonna end well. The other thing is that the 1 rep max is probably gonna move very quickly over the amount of time that we just spend working on it, meaning your 1 rep max might be 100 pounds on a squat starting off. It might be 150 in 6 weeks, and that's a 50% improvement. So if I was writing numbers off of when you started, again, it's gonna be really easy, really quick. And so again, this is me talking about traditional weight training approaches, right? Exercise selection is gonna be very unique to the individual ability and injury history. You guys can all think of some of your fellow runner friends who their toe touch looks like this. They shouldn't deadlift from the floor. That's a horrible idea. You're also going to have a lot of people that can't squat to traditional depth, and trying to do so with load might look like this. Again, not a good idea to squat them like that. My job isn't to try to get you into those positions, because like I said, if I focus too much on increasing your range of motion and certain attributes, it might not bode well. Chances are it won't do anything, to be completely honest, but for me, my job is to do no harm. My job is to make you more resilient and improve the ability. So a lot of the times, I am not going to be dogmatic about traditional strength training approaches. Meaning, everybody knows what a back squat is. Everybody, when you just say squat, they just think back squat under a bar. For me, maybe I'll goblet squat you, maybe I'll front squat, maybe I'll split squat. Same thing is, if you look at my Instagram and my Facebook posts, a lot of the time I have the athletes using this trap bar. It's because this is going to require a lot less mobility to get in from a deadlift. It's going to load the joints much safer. I don't have to think about a lot of this stuff. Don't get me wrong, I love deadlifting and squatting and doing all the traditional movements. But for a lot of endurance athletes, that is a square peg and you're trying to push it through a round hole. Progression of skill and overload are a must. And so here is one of the things that I have had some adversity to when starting a lot of my athletes. A lot of people knew what they did in high school. They knew that they did the back squat. They didn't know that, again, they might not have been doing it to depth. It might be counterintuitive to do it to their strength, injury, whatever profile. And so a lot of the times when people are coming off season and we're trying to get them strong and resilient, I'm going to progress their skills and I'm going to try to overload them over time. Meaning, first few sessions aren't going to be that hard. Don't get me wrong, I'm going to try to make it so that it's fun. I'm going to try to make it so that over time, there's some things that you can do that you feel like you got a good workout. But there needs to be a commitment to the process and to getting better to actually be able to get under load. Because if I just start you off day one and we're trying to get that fiber conversion where you're loading heavy, it's not going to go well over the long term of progress. And so that's why programs have to be centered more around consistency before intensity. Being consistent in the off season plays huge dividends in the preseason and postseason, or in season. And so that a lot of times I talk to people about just how they can incorporate weight training. Which leads us into this. So one of the actual pros about adding strength to your regimen is that you don't need to spend as much time training other attributes. Mainly the speed, especially when it's first applied. So like you don't have to do as much high intensity runs, high intensity stuff. But again, this is going to be more important in the off season. Once you get to preseason, you're starting to focus on your main builds. Like you're really starting to train for that first try. I am just an accessory coach by then. Whatever your try coach wants, I write the program around. Generally, what I try to do is I try to get a commitment to the athlete and the coach. Just be like, okay, I want 2 hours a week of strength training, and I just want that to be a supplement, or I want that to be kind of a replacement to some of the other stuff you might do. Yamamoto found that was actually gave the best results and decreased injuries the most. It is also important, so like I said, it's important to monitor the fatigue and make sure everything's fitting cohesively, going back to those first few slides that we talked about. If that's not considered, then all else is lost. All right, when you should start, again, best time is right off season when you're not training. It's cool because we can look at some of the things that were maladaptations over the season, like so just things that we're starting to like wear too much, that if that envelope of function of certain joints was starting to wear down, we're going to try to bring it back up. As someone becomes very strong and they can do a lot of work in here, right? And so this goes more for people that are doing trying to like compete and like, so for me, I try to make myself so I have a really high strength profile because I like to powerlift, but I also like to function as a mountain biker at a decent level. You then need to actually make the workouts mesh, meaning if I'm going to do a heavy squat workout, that's also going to be the same day that I do my wind sprints on the bike, because those two stressors are very similar and will recover at similar rates, versus if I did wind sprints on Monday and I squatted on Tuesday, my squats are going to suck and I'm going to hate life, and I just made it so the recovery is longer. Most people do not have to worry about this. This is just something though, occasionally I do get the triathlete, the cyclist, or whoever who's also a gym bro and they're actually pretty strong, and that is when I need to actually start considering this. Does anybody have questions on when you should start, how to get strong, anything like that? No? Okay. All right, so program design. This is when things get a little, well, they can be fun, right? So this is where I want you guys to ask a lot of questions, because again, I would love to work with you, but my job today is to make it so that you guys know what to do in the weight room moving forward. As you've seen thus far, you can go really down the rabbit hole of what you can do. I'm gonna tell you right now that just getting better at picking up heavy things, keeping comfortable, and progressively loading over time is going to give you more results than anything else. The big thing about design, again, if we're talking about stress management, is just considering how much strength should go where. So in the off season, 2 to 3 times a week, moderate to high volume. Most of the volume is just gonna come from learning the movements. Again, I'm not gonna try to turn you into a bodybuilder. I'm not gonna try to blow you up. What I mean by that is a high volume program is generally what's known to be more hypertrophic, meaning if you look at what a bodybuilder does, it's a crap ton of volume, right? They're trying to grow, that's the adaptation. The funny thing is if you look at the traditional, like we're training endurance here, like in the muscles, it's like a 4x15. If you look at what a bodybuilder does to grow his delts, it's a 4x15. So for me, I'd rather the high volume be implemented in a way that we are building skill, building resilience in the joints, and so they're going to be a little more specific. So again, the goal for the off season, positive tissue adaptation, joint function, and increasing their loading strategy. Pre-season, and what I mean by this, for me, I identify the pre-season as before your build, your first build for your first race, because that is what I want these things to go to. If I can make it so that that fiber conversion happens before that first build, I know you're using it, so it'll be applied more. If I try to do this before your first race, as you can see, 2 times a week, moderate to high intensity, then I'm just adding more stress, and that profile is not going to look as good in that bucket. In the competitive season, 1 to 2 times a week, low volume, high intensity. The goal is to maintain that type 2A adaptation and joint integrity. So these are going to be very specific to the individual, to what's going on. And again, there's a ton of ways that you can skin this cat. So we're going to try to just, again, give you guys what you need to know. So what you should lift, the type of exercises you should be doing. This is why, again, when you look at like the 5 exercises that you should be doing, you'll see 100 different ones. Some form of squat, lunge, hinge, push, pull, and then pick up something and carry it. To me, that's actually the basis of what you need to do. We can sub certain things out. As you see, I have different loading strategies that I like for specific reasons that we'll talk about. The long answer, of course, is it's going to depend on you, what you can do, what you're comfortable with, what you have access to. I have a pretty highly competitive cyclist that lives in DC and trains out of her apartment gym. She doesn't have access to barbells. She uses dumbbells. And that's cool because she can be consistent, and that's the #1 goal. I'm going to talk about this very briefly. In the off season, I want to work more here. So this is the training hierarchy pyramid. This just shows that, like, if you want to get this pyramid taller, you have a bigger base. And this is very movement specific. So essentially, working on general physical attributes is going to help build specific physical attributes, and then your skills, and then your performance. So right here is competition. Right here is a lot of your training that's specific to try. Right here is a lot of the body adaptations, so like the way the tendons adapt and stuff like that. And then right here is just a very general, how unkillable are you as a human, right? So a lot of times over the competitive season, this will shrink because you're starting to work a lot on this. So in my job in the off season, we're trying to actually work on attributes that don't get touched at all in triathlon. That's why you'll see what it looks like in a few weeks when people start coming back to me is goblet squat isos. So just holding in the bottom. This looks nothing even close to what you do in triathlon. We are not building the stiffness. We are not building anything close. We're making other things more resilient. Glute bridges, lateral lunges, monster walks, all that stuff. Essentially, I'm training similar muscles, but in very different ways. Except for when I get to the specific, that's when we're starting to train similar muscles in specific ways to apply. This is the preseason training. And I only point that out because if you go into performance circles, you will generally see people talking about sport-specific training. And if they stay here a long time, it's not going to end well. It generally treats your body right. That's where you're going to see, again, that envelope of function starting to decrease because you just keep wearing down the same thing. And so even this, though, for me, this is how I classify it. If you were to talk to any coach, they would throw certain things in different areas, right? So you might even talk to like your tri-specific coach, and if they work on this type of model, this might only be weight training. They might not even contribute, like think that it goes past that. So again, this is kind of my opinion on this part. All right, so we'll talk about methods. Does anybody have any questions on just the exercise prescription of like just choosing what you should do? Okay. All right, so methods. I love my methods. So if you have a system down, which for me is this, and knowing what we should work on when, that's my system. The methods are what the adaptations that we want, and for me, the exercises is how I want those adaptations applied. This is as deep as we're going to go here because if you're a strength coach, you're probably super interested in this. For you guys, I'm just going to talk very quickly about each one. Progressive overload should be the one that if you guys take anything away from this, it's progressive overload. That means if you were to squat tomorrow, and again, you're off season. Let's say you do 3 sets of 10 at 15 pounds. You're doing a goblet squat. Wednesday, 3 sets of 10, 20 pounds. Friday, 25. And you progress the load. As long as you are recovering each time, the stress should become higher and higher and higher, and you should be able to move pretty high up. Over time, this will make it so that your perception of load has changed. It will also give you the most, make you the most resilient to actually prevent training issues. So a lot of people, again, this is when a lot of people go in and they just go ham day 1 and then day 2 and day 3 and they're doing random crap. They'll hurt themselves because they didn't seep their body into it slowly with progressive overload. If I have an injured athlete, so like I have right now, one lady who she's had 5 back surgeries, she's got metal all up in that back. She deadlifts her body weight. She didn't used to be able to do that. She used to be scared to pick something up. She used to be scared to do split squats. I got her there from progressive overload. We picked one exercise that she could do. We slowly added weight over time. Then we changed the exercise once it got heavy, and we started it so that she could still load more, and load more, different exercise. The next thing you know, she's doing barbell deadlifts like a champ. It made her back resilient, her back pain went away, and all of it was just over time. And that's why I said consistency will pay dividends, and just go easy with it, be consistent. Eventually, if you progressive overload enough, you can do max effort method. That's what Christy is doing here. And with max effort method, that is the lifting heavy. Different coaches are gonna have different definitions for this. For me, for an endurance athlete, if I can get you to hit a heavy set of 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, I consider myself to be hitting more max effort method. If you were to talk to the traditional strength buffs powerlifters, they would say no, only 1 rep, max, So for me though, I'm just looking at the adaptation I want. Now you'll notice that when Christy does it here, if I can get it to go, she's gonna hit 1 or 2. I can't remember what's in this video. She's got roughly like 200 pounds on the bar, and then I believe 80 pounds worth of chains. So pretty impressive. We got her there through progressive overload, and we're using accommodating resistance. The reason accommodating resistance is cool is because as she lifts that, it's getting heavier, and is making it closer to feel like a max effort. And it's a lot easier on the joints. Having it so that it's light here and then just gets harder as you're going is going to load you as if you're doing a hard max, even though it might not be as hard. It's going to make it so you slow down, so you're getting the adaptation through the whole range of motion, and our tissues are going to stay under more tension. I love accommodating resistance. The only thing that I will say about it is it's really hard to apply in different training venues. We are lucky here at SAPT that we have chains, bands, fancy stuff. We also have specialty bars, specialty loading tools, so a lot of times if someone has any issues, I can figure it out a way. The only issue is when people train elsewhere, sometimes we can hook up a band and stuff, but it becomes harder. Tempo lifting, you can also apply tempo over time. I'm gonna get into this a little deeper later, but essentially with tempo lifting, there's a bunch of adaptations. There's even some theories that if I made you do, let's say 3 sets of 10 at a slow tempo, up and down, that I can actually make your slow twitch fibers bigger, and then your lactate threshold should improve. I will say that I have I use it because it won't hurt, but I personally don't think that you're gonna see as a big improvement on an endurance athlete versus, like I said, like maybe a lacrosse player, because they already don't have that big a lactate threshold. You guys are, like I said, pretty advanced in that realm. Isometric holds, so just holding at the bottom, plyometrics and repetitive effort method. Isometric holds and plyometrics are 2 ends of the spectrum. Plyometrics are going to make you stiffer and more bouncy. Isometric holds are going to kind of do the opposite as far as the connective tissue adaptation. We're going to get into that more later. Repetitive effort method is just for me, and again, different coaches are going to define the methods differently. It's based off how they apply them. For me, repetitive effort method means pick a certain weight, hit it as many times as you functionally can, meaning like, all right, stop when there's 2 left. That's really good for cyclists. I don't use it as much for runners because that will build muscle, but it also builds a lot of other good things that, again, I'm just not going to go too deep in. All right. Does anybody, before we get into this is kind of the last big topic before I just give you guys some takeaways, and this one's kind of a doozy. Does anybody have any questions on kind of applying some of these? Or progressive overload, if you can take anything home, it's that. So does anybody have any questions on progressive overload? Right. So again, this is the money when it comes to some extra things that you can do with strength training to making yourself more resilient. If we go back to talking about repetitive strain injuries and that envelope of function, a lot of them are going to depend on the collagen and tendons and other connective tissue profiles of that joint. For me as a strength coach, if I can help improve the integrity of that, I've done you a great service. There's going to be kind of a spectrum here that we need to understand as far as the tendons go. So tendons are vasoelastic, meaning it's almost like when you slap water and how they respond. So if I have a tendon and I apply a really slow resistance to it, it'll have a lot of give. If I jerk it, it'll all of a sudden stiffen up. So it's almost like when you're putting your hand in the water and it just moves apart versus when you slap it. When you're running, obviously, bam, 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 you're slapping that water, it should be getting stiffer. That's an adaptation that should happen. That's why the tendons get stiffer, the ankles get stiffer, your running economy goes up. And in my opinion, that's one of the adaptations that happens over time to actually make you more resilient and handle the workload because economy went up. There's a lot of studies out there that are trying to figure out if tendon stiffness actually makes you more likely to tendinopathy. What I will say is that if you look at any runner, they have specific adaptations that happens to the tendons that we traditionally thought were bad, but might actually be good. And so again, here's where I'm not going to go too deep because we don't know specifically where things lie. But what you do need to know is that collagen is a type of connective tissue protein that synthesizes in response to load, and cross-links are molecular bonds between the proteins. So here is the myotendinous junction of, I think it was a plantaris muscle, and it's got these vaginations in it. So the way a tendon should work is when it's closer to the bone, it should be a lot stiffer. There's more cross-links. If I had the collagen fibers right here, and they slide, a cross-link would almost be like this little thing right here, so they don't slide as much. So the more cross-links, the stiffer. Just anatomically, you have less cross-links right here, and so it's more compliable, and it's softer, and that makes it so that when the muscle goes to receive the load, it's not all of a sudden just getting jerking and pulling. You can almost think of cross-links in a way like Velcro, the way they get on this stuff. Now, the interesting thing is that, let me see a picture. All right, yeah. So the interesting thing is that for tendons in general, when they have a injury to it, so a lot of times, like some form of tendinopathy or if there's a tear, it's not like muscle where it just kind of grows back. It grows over. So it'll almost start to look like a knot in this wood. And it's kind of hard to affect it after that. So a lot of times if someone gets like a core tendinopathy, it's really hard to deal with. and they need to, over time, build more collagen fibers over top of it and make it more resilient. And that becomes hard. So that's why when you look at a lot of times, you'll see thickened tendons and different responses. Again, we're not gonna get too hairy. One of the things that you need to know is that because the vasoelastic component of tendons, because of the way collagen remodels, and because of the adaptation to stress, you can almost look at this as a spectrum, all right? If I do isometric holds and slower stuff, it's going to make it so that the tendons are forced to move a little bit more and cross-links break, meaning the tendons will become more resilient and good things will happen to the collagen. Plyometrics, again, are really good, but they will just keep increasing that stiffness. And obviously you shouldn't do some form of plyometric on a tendinopathy. This is where, after reading a lot of this and dissecting the research from a guy named Keith Barr, who I need to give a shout out to because a lot of the stuff came from him. Whereas I think plyometrics are great, I think in the off season, all of us need to spend some time doing these because essentially if you get that knot in there, that scar tissue, it's going to be resistant to loading. So if you look the way it would go, this area wouldn't get loading, and so the collagen wouldn't build over it well. If I can apply an isometric contraction that holds, one of the things that happens is that the muscle tissue will start to relax at different areas of pull, and all of a sudden you'll start getting pull on this area that wasn't getting it before. So a lot of times if you look at my programming, a lot of people are like, why are you having this guy hold the bottom of a split squat, the bottom of a squat for like 30 seconds to a minute, you know, especially based off what you told me on the other stuff. It's because I know that you've taken a crap ton of stress in your Achilles and patellar tendons over the season, and I just think that we should probably do some time focusing on getting that GPP back and the resilience in the tendon, and then build you back anew with plyometrics. So a lot of times, immediately off season, I'll do these two, but I'm not going to do this. And over time, as we're building for your preseason, we're going to introduce plyometrics later. So you can look at the application of these. Again, it's a spectrum. Super slow hold, lift everything slow, be explosive. You can see what they do. It increases stiffness. This will make it so that stronger areas relax, and so that the areas that are resistant because of that one issue it might have start to get the stress. And then this one is in the middle. It's low velocity, and it creates shear along that myotendinous junction. This is that thing that looked like this, and it'll help the integrity of that tissue. The other thing is that by doing some isometric holds, it'll increase the collagen of the weak spot, but the other benefit is it'll greatly increase the strength relative to that joint angle. And so that's another benefit, is because generally with runners, you guys are really strong in quads right here. You're not as strong here. And for some of the loading things I want to do, I might just have you do an isometric because it kills two birds with one stone right here moving forward. Tempo lifting, it can positively adapt the muscles as well. So again, this might do the conversion factor of type 2A. And then plyometrics, if you use them right, it can also increase your bone density. So again, that's going to go in that stress, making sure you recover. Does anybody have questions on this, on the actual, because I know this part is hairy. I tried to make it so I wasn't going too deep into the woods, but I just needed to make sure you understand force will help collagen, and there's specific ways we can lay that collagen down to be useful. Cool. All right, we're gonna talk quickly about plyometrics. These are a big bang for your buck exercise, but again, I don't like using them until I know that all the stress is gone from the in-season. If you have a BMI greater than 30, I don't like to use it. If you have a history of tendinopathy or stress fracture, I don't like to use it. And if I get someone that comes in and they just have lots of instability, can't control their joints when they land, I'm not gonna use it. You also need to make sure that the person has a good strength training base before going. A lot of times, until we hit a certain strength on maybe the trap bar or a squat, I'm not gonna worry too much about plyometrics, except for maybe like jump ropes. Here is my friend Goose. He is a contributing coach of TryStrengthCoach.com. He's actually one of the coaches for the US Olympic Training Center. And so I run ideas by him with his track athletes all the time. Here's a sample of a very applied plyometric for running. So there he is training the stiffness of his Achilles. I don't know anybody that can jump that high with plyometrics. Goose ran track for Mason. He's a freak. Don't try to be Goose. But that type of jump, what he's doing is he's loading the Achilles tendon in the same way that it would be loading usually in running skate at the bottom, but he's putting a crap ton more force. One thing that I will say is, again, if I've worked someone up enough, I will do that, because then we're working the intensity side of that spectrum, and ideally it should make their body's perception of that stress be better, things more resilient. All right, we're gonna go into sample programs. Again, I don't want to spend a whole lot of time on this because this is my programming. This is going to be different than what some of you guys might do for your own. So again, this is just how I like to program. I don't expect you to know what pull-throughs are or pup taps or anything like that. I'll talk very briefly on this. So for me, starting off with an athlete, and this is someone that I'm assuming doesn't have a huge weight training background. Again, I'm going to apply some of the more isometric, slow, not specific to try movements to try to adapt their body correctly. So here I'm going to do that to their calves. I will say doing a calf isometric I really like to do when I know someone's coming back from and has been released by a physical therapist, but coming back from tendinopathy. Generally, there's not a really great way to apply it unless you have a leg press or some other contraption. So a lot of times I just have them do tempo calf raises. I start to teach them pull-throughs. That's a way to start to load a deadlift without loading the spine. Goblet box squat eccentric, so going slow down and getting used to that tempo and getting used to a bunch of other things. And again, this is all tempo-based stuff, so it's going to be a little bit more resilient on those myotendinous junctions. Isometric holds are sprinkled throughout, and I'm having them work certain muscles in ways that they aren't even applied in running, right? So, or cycling or swimming. So monster walks, you never do this in your sport, but you do use this muscle to stabilize. You generally will see that I will hit some of these attributes as we get closer, but I'll put less emphasis on them moving forward. The other things that you'll notice is that I am doing specific things to develop their trunk to stabilize load. What you gotta understand is, again, if I wanna get you to hold those heavy things and get that type 2A adaptation, I need to get you so that you can safely trap bar deadlift a good amount of weight, you can safety squat amount of weight, whatever exercise I choose. So that being said, I make people goblet carry for time, or just holding a heavy weight here, and we'll increase that weight over time. That'll increase your trunk strength. That'll increase a lot of good stuff. I might make you crawl for a lot of time to increase trunk. Doesn't carry over as well to lifting heavy things, but it does a lot of good stuff for body awareness. And what I will say just really quick is endurance athletes tend to have more poor body awareness because they just aren't doing as many specific different types of exercises. If you look at athletes in general, like gymnasts have phenomenal body awareness. Look how many different movements they have to do. So in the grand scheme of things, the more diverse athletes' movements are, it's going to be an increase in body awareness. So I try to work on that a little bit here because that alone will make you more resilient. Preseason, so kind of building up to before your build, I might be working a little bit harder. I might, again, depending on assuming the person here had issues with some calf length, so they couldn't squat to depth very well. So we moved them to a front rack split squat. Again, if you look at my Instagram and stuff, some of the stuff I have athletes. Exercises a lot of people haven't seen, but I'm trying to load them in specific ways that can be heavy and safe on the joints. I'll have them doing bounds and cone hops, so some of the higher end for a beginner, but we're trying to really drill it home. You still got the tempo stuff. Now you have sissy ham, so that's the eccentric loading of the hamstrings. Trap bar deadlift for your foot elevated split squat, lots of good stuff. So we're starting to get more plyos, we're starting to get more compound, and you're having those sport-specific prep movements start to occur. And so for here, you're starting to go into a higher intensity of loading, so heavier weights. Versus the in-season where it's low volume, it's high intensity, get in, get out, get the adaptation, make sure you're maintaining the stuff we worked on, make sure you're maintaining integrity. Again, depending on where someone's at, what things happen, because you guys are doing so much else, this might change. We're still doing some jumps, and they're probably a little bit more specific, but they're really low volume. We're doing stuff we're doing the accommodating resistance because we're trying to still maintain the adaptation, but be easy on the joints. We're having you squat to a box, meaning you sit down actually on the box and come back up. Because again, that offloads the joints. You're not going to have as much stress. And we're doing some things that usually, like I said, if I have a cyclist, I want to make sure that back extension kind of stays strong, even though I might not be loading as much goblet and stuff. So many ways to skin this cat. Programming, there are literally hundreds of books written on it. And so you're going to have each coach try to do it a different way. Again, if I could give you anything to take away, pick your movements that are easy for you to do right now, progress them to a point where they start to get heavier, change them out to something where you might be able to sustain more load with, start easy again, keep going. If you guys do that on your own, you're great. In the off season, don't do plyometrics, do a lot of iso holds. As you get closer to your build, start to throw in plyometrics. As you start to get in season, keep in mind the amount of stress already going on the joints, and we want to do as little in the way of adding to that as possible. But we want to do the most of just making sure you are able to hold that high intensity weights. So like kind of just heavy, but done. The other thing is that I will acknowledge right now, a lot of people think that lifting heavy is going to be super stressful and like create a lot of fatigue. For endurance athletes, I find it doesn't. I find you guys you bounce back so much more. And keep in mind, your profile is going to be completely different to say like a powerlifter. Again, I am squatting heavy almost 5 days a week. I am bouncing back just fine. I'm not running and stuff too, but for you guys, just because your adaptations, you're just not going to be as strong because this isn't your priority, right? So you're not going to be squatting 400 pounds. You're going to be squatting probably less than what you can, but more of what you perceive you can, and it's not going to add as much stress. Does anybody have questions on this? Yes?
So is this what you prescribe to any athlete, or do you assess their movements?
So my way of assessment has changed probably 20 different times over the last 5 years. Mainly because, again, you see different research come out and I change. My way that I assess now is, again, I want to measure things that are going to affect what I do. So I'm going to do a lot of talking about your lifestyle, about everything, about injury history and stuff, and that's going to determine here. Let's say if this person has a history of stress fracture, cone hops, bounding are automatically gone. Let's say this person has knee issues, front rack split squat, probably not going to be the thing I give. The thing about strength training is that it is so malleable to the individual, and that's one of the reasons why I've fallen in love with it. Like even with this, I can still do it, right? The thing is a lot of times people get very dogmatic, and so you'll see this in the training field as well, like all throughout, where they think you guys have to back squat, I have to put you in there. You don't need to. You can find the movements that work to yourself. So for me, these are actual programs that I've written in the past for certain athletes. Oops, too far. But it's going to depend so much on the person. Now, I will tell you, when I've worked with groups, I'll look at the majority of the group. I'll make an avatar, if you will, and I'll program that avatar. And then if someone has knee issues, I'm like, all right, instead of this, I want you to do this. And so a lot of times if I work with, say, a team, I'll have like 3 different programs. The team will use it. I'll just put the people in those programs, and I'll tell them, when I'm reviewing things, I'm like, all right, just reach out to me, and I will tell you the modification that I want you to do. And then the other thing, and it's not listed here because this is when it becomes more advanced, is that if I am going to make it, I like to use what we call RPE, rate of perceived exertion, very different in the way that you guys apply it, right? But I try to set it so that you're working at specific intensities for you that particular day, and I know I'm not adding too much stress. Because again, think if I use that percentage-based profile and you had a 7-hour bike the day before, you might not hit that, right? In general, what I will say while I'm on the subject is the really long, slow distance, just volume, usually doesn't affect weight training as much as if you did like the hardcore stuff. So like I said, that's where I like to consolidate the stressors. So you will bounce back from that long, slow ride, as long as you are, zone 2 work. You will be able to do this just fine the next day. And also, this might affect volume stuff, but this is why I like to have this. I'm more concerned about the high intensity stuff that you're doing. And so if I know someone like, hey, I'm going to strength train on this day, but this is the day that I do my high intensity stuff, that'll also change how I'm programming. So again, keep in mind, depending on working with a group or an individual, is going to determine a lot of these components. But with strength training, there's so many ways to skin the cat, to modify loading, to modify an exercise, tempo, all of it. And that's why it can become very hairy for people that aren't coaches, right? But like I said, if you just find what your body likes and you just throw in some of these movements, you can keep it really simple. So. No, so keep in mind you can apply it however you want. And one of the things that isometrics will do over time is they actually should improve range of motion because of the tissue resilience. Like, so I can't do isometrics on this right now, but I am going to as soon as I can get load on it because it will help the resilience of that tendon that's become super stiff because it hasn't been loaded. And so you'll see that range of motion actually improves. Keith Barr, again, the guy who's the main researcher that I pulled a lot of that from, they had a basketball player who had a really bad tendinopathy on his knee, and he was a professional, and so they needed to get him playing. And so what they did over time is like 2 or 3 times a week they had him hold on a leg press isometric, and they had MRI showing before and after, and the Achilles or the patellar tendon looked significantly different. Now he didn't go into angle. Obviously, angle could make a difference, but ideally if you're holding tension on that tendon, as long as it's enough to get load there, it should be fine. But in the case of like patellofemoral syndrome, it becomes kind of an issue. Like that's where, again, a physical therapist should kind of set where you can work, and then we work comfortably and we try to improve that capacity for loading. Was there any other questions on program design? Yeah. This is just if they're doing twice a week. Yeah, so like a lot of athletes, maybe they'll just do 1 time a week. And so I'll consolidate. So some athletes, in season will be 1 time a week. And so again, this is, yeah, so a lot of times it'll just be one of these. So you'll notice like, especially, these are total body workouts each day. If you're an endurance athlete, you should be doing a total body workout each day. Doing like bodybuilding splits are usually gonna kind of like, just make it so you can't get as much done. So a lot of times if someone's not doing, if they're only doing 1 day, for me, I'm like, okay, what are the most important things here? For here, I can kind of distribute it a little bit more, but it's again, it's going to depend on that person. And this is where, like for me, so I do one-on-one and and a small group training, like 2 people, and I also will do online coaching, like hybrid, where I'm giving the person the program, they come to see me as needed, or I've even given programs to teams. It'll just depend on their schedule, like their access to stuff. A lot of things go into the dependency of this. And so, if I know their coach is hammering them hard, I'm gonna be like, no, they only need 1 time a week. They don't need to. This 1 time a week's enough to maintain a lot of the times. 2 times a week is just if I know that there's enough slack in that system and we can do it, I'll give it. And I'll even say, oops, of course. I'll even say that, a lot of the time I tell people like, all right, I need to know what are you, on your hardest week, what are you gonna be able to do? If it's just 1, then you're gonna do 1 the whole time because I want it to be consistent. So like if someone's just bouncing around, they're only doing A days for a while and then they jump to B days and all this stuff is new. And I wanna make sure, again, that like things are consistent. Consistency is always gonna be safer, right? So, any other questions? All right, wrapping up. Takeaways and other tips. So cross training needs to be controlled and coordinated with your main training. That's why you saw that pre-season, in-season, off-season. I will say that that's the biggest takeaway, if anything. If you just try to throw things in, you don't know what you're gonna do. Injury prevention is more about the big picture and less about rolling and stretching. Rolling and stretching are great ways to treat the sensory input. They're a great way to make you feel better, but they don't do much for that stress profile. It's important to pick exercises that work for your body and not ones that you just think you should do, right? So if you're like, oh, I'm really bad at this and this is like feels really awkward and hurt, maybe you shouldn't do it, right? So body composition can be a very important factor in performance and injury prevention and should be worked in the off season. If you're trying to go on a caloric deficit while you compete, bad things happen. You're just not going to compete well. When possible, lift barefoot. Vibram got sued not too long ago because they kept claiming that their shoes did X, Y, and Z, but the research didn't support it. I will speak very anecdotally. If you're wearing really padded running shoes, your deadlifts aren't going to look that good. You're pretty much on an AirX pad and you're trying to stabilize load. Try to go barefoot. Again, Goose, the guy who is the strength coach for the US Olympic Committee, I talk to him pretty frequently because he works with track and Paralympic track. When they started doing a lot more barefoot lifts, they had a lot less shin splints, and they had a lot better results with just the dexterity and stuff of the feet. And the other thing is, if you think about with plantar fasciitis and what I said about loading and isometrics and all of that, you're essentially applying an isometric hold to your plantar fascia when you're barefoot. Picking up heavy things will make you healthier and improve performance. The goal is that you just got to get there. Like I said, don't expect that the first day in the weight room that you should go heavy. Plyometrics are awesome, but need to be managed appropriately. Most strength coaches will look at how many touches to the ground they're doing at plyometrics. And keep in mind, plyometrics are going to be different from jump training. Like, I'll teach someone to jump, but a plyometric is when you're bouncing. Okay. Muscular stiffness is a good thing if you want to be faster. Stiffness is not what you feel. If your back feels stiff, that is not what I'm referring to here. That is a sensory input, and actually the funny thing in tendinopathy in the research, they showed that the perceived stiffness in tendinopathy is just generally, like, again, only sensory, and it doesn't have as much to do with the actual quality of the tendon. Treating that is good because that is just some of the, that'll go a long way to helping the mental, the pain, the perception, and it definitely, pain and everything like that, discomfort needs to be attended to in the long term of an athlete, but being objective, decreasing the stiffness in your calf is just going to probably hurt more than help. Strength training is a process and needs consistent involvement to reap the rewards. So I'm not saying you need to, again, be a gym bro 3 days a week. I am saying that you just need to maintain the skill in some of these movements, and you need to just maintain your joints and integrity well. You don't need to kill yourself. You can just go in, do what needs to be done, pick up a few things, and go. Not to-dos. This is the only slide that I didn't give photo cred to an outside picture just because I hate it that much. So when you're doing strength work, it's important to not try to get the traditional workout feel. So a lot of people try to do heart rate training. I used to have tons of athletes, actually when I worked for Fast Track, that I had a couple of them that they did things like Orange Theory for their cross training. Orange Theory, I have my own opinion on. If you're trying to lose weight and get a workout, fine. I totally agree. I'm glad. If you're really enjoying it, great. If you're trying to get some of the adaptations we talked about today, they're better off done just simply with weight training where you can control the volume. And keep in mind, with most group fitness classes or group fitness programs, the volume is going to be applied to the group. The exercises are applied to the group. They're not for you individuals. If you have something catered towards triathletes and endurance athletes, phenomenal. But most of the time, that's just not going to be the case. Choose intensity over consistency. So do not do that. I've talked at length already about that. Utilize passment treatment modalities only to handle injuries. So this is really big in the endurance community, and it's just the idea of like a deep tissue massage will cure everything. I'm a massage therapist. I will gladly give you a deep tissue massage. I am part of the process. Me telling you how tight you are is not a big part of the process. That probably is causing more harm than good. A lot of the times we need to actually figure out what modifications can be made in your lifestyle, your training, your movement, your strength. All of those things are where you need to put your focus. Passive treatment modalities are the cherry on top. They will make everything else move better. They will make you more compliant. They are great, but they are not the main thing you should be doing. Do not cheat your rest periods. Something that almost every endurance athlete I've ever had, they'll do that heavy deadlift. 45 seconds will go by. All right, let's do it again. There are specific adaptations, again, that we want. I want you to actually take your time. I will say, and this goes a little bit deeper into the physiology, there's some newer research that came out. I think that the French cycling team did, where they did a very odd prescription of like 13 reps at a heavy weight and 4 minutes off, which is, you know, you've never seen exercise prescriptions like that in strength conditioning. But what it did is it actually helped certain qualities of the muscle to increase force production without increasing bulk or anything like that. So just stick to your rest periods. Don't work too hard. Don't use sport-specific exercises year-round. You're just asking for issues. Don't do curls in the squat rack. We'll all laugh at you. As a trainer, that's something we see. Don't do it. Just gym etiquette, letting you know. Don't view yourself as anything other than an unbreakable, adaptable organism. Apparently I forgot that last part. So one of the things that I work on specifically when I have athletes, and this goes in the endurance field specifically too, because a lot of endurance athletes, they view themselves as maybe not as strong because you guys are endurance. You don't go to the weight room that much. There's usually issues with confidence in the gym. I try to break that down as much as I can. I want people to think, I want you to have confidence in the weight room, I want you to feel unbreakable, and I want you to feel adaptable. When you come back from injury, even this right here, my big thing that I've been saying is that it's broke, but I'm not broken. You need to always think that you are strong, resilient, can overcome. And the reason is if you remember at the very beginning of that, at the presentation when I talked about the stress bucket model, perception is everything. If you perceive that your hips are off, it's shown that you're more likely to have back pain, regardless of if your hips are off. If you perceive yourself to have a bad knee, your knee is more likely to hurt. If you perceive yourself as being unbreakable, adaptable, strong, resilient, you are more likely to be those things. I am not saying that you should think that you can overcome every obstacle. You know, if you haven't punched through a 2x4, you're probably not going to right now. There needs to be a nice progressive building of the mentality, and that's why I like progressive overload so much, because every day you're getting a little bit stronger, and by day 30, you're now squatting again maybe 50% more than what you started with, and that's really freaking cool. And that's it. Do I have any questions? I know I threw a lot at you, so. All right, so I want to thank you guys all for coming. Again, for me, here at Brumett, I own JB Pain and Performance Solutions. I rent from SAPT. I am also, I wanted to put this presentation together largely because this is kind of my flagship for my new brand of TryStrengthCoach.com, in which I'm going to be providing online strength conditioning to endurance athletes and swimmers. Like I said, I work a lot of in-person. I do nutritional coaching, I do massage, I do training, but I'm also starting a program where it's hybrid, meaning I program for you, I coach you online. When you need it, you come in. With endurance athletes, your schedule is everything. Consistency needs to be everything. If I can just guide you from afar and see you when you need those form checks, when you need to get checked up on, that's great.